going to tell you the story of Snakes and Pearls by Charles Perrault, which was published in 1697. But this is how I will tell that story to you. Once upon a time, there was a young woman who lived with her stepmother and her stepsister. She had sadly lost her mother and her father. She had no other family, so her stepmother and her stepsister cared for her and treated her gently and with kindness. And, oh, come on, this is a fairy tale. We know that isn't going to happen. I had a stepmother and I loved her dearly, and I have a stepsister and I love her dearly. But in fairy tales, we know how it goes with stepmothers. Her stepmother treated this young woman like a servant. She had to do all the jobs in the house while her own daughter sat around eating chocolate. So this young woman had to do everything in the house. She had to do the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, the sewing. She even had to clean the toilet. But the worst job was having to go and fetch the water. Now, of course, in these times, you couldn't just turn on the tap and get water. You had to get water from the well. The problem was the well was at the end of the world. And one day, the woman said to her stepdaughter, "Take the bucket to the well at the end of the world and fill it with water. We need more water." So the stepdaughter, the young woman, took the bucket and off she went to the well at the end of the world. And it was a hot day, and by the time she reached the well, she was hot and dusty. There was sweat upon her brow, but her problems were forgotten very quickly. When she saw, sitting next to the well, there was an old woman bent over with twisted hands, an old woman with bare feet that were dusty and dirty, an old woman that was trying to catch her breath. And the stepdaughter, the young woman, looked at her and said, "Mother, are you all right? Is there anything I can do for you?" And the old woman said, "Oh, it is such a hot day. Please, could you fetch me some water from the well? I see you have a bucket with you." And the young woman, the stepdaughter, said, "Of course, mother, of course I will do that." So she hooked her bucket on the chain of the well and lowered the bucket into the well and drew out water and gave the old woman water to drink. But not only that. She soaked her apron in the water from the well and she wiped the old woman's face. She cleaned the old woman's hands and she washed the old woman's feet. And the old woman looked at her and said, "Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you. Now you need to go home. Fetch some water from the well." So the stepdaughter, the young woman, fetched a bucket of water for home from the well. And as she walked away from the old woman, she waved goodbye. And the old woman called out after her, "You shall receive your reward." Of course, when the stepdaughter, the young woman, got home, it was later than her stepmother had expected. So when she walked in the house with the bucket of water, her stepmother said to her, "Where have you been?" And her stepsister said, "Where have you been? Where have you been?" And the young woman said, "I'm sorry I'm late." As she said the words, "I'm sorry I'm late," from her lips fell pearls onto the ground. Her stepmother looked at the pearls on the ground and then looked at her and said, "Where did they come from?" And the stepsister said, "Where did they come from? Where did they come from?" And the young woman said, "I don't know." But as she said, "I don't know," from her lips fell diamonds. She explained that she had gone to the well and she had met the old woman and she had helped the old woman. And as she explained her story to her stepmother and her stepsister, with every word from her lips fell diamonds and rubies and pearls, until there was a pile of precious stones on the ground. Her stepmother thought for a moment. The old woman! She was a fairy! She looked at her own daughter and said, "Tomorrow you go to the well. You go to the well and you help the old woman, and then you will have diamonds and rubies and pearls." And her daughter looked back at her and said, "Oh, that's so unfair." But the next day she was sent off with the bucket in the heat of the day to the well at the end of the world. She was stomping her feet by the time that she reached the well. She was not a happy young woman, and she was even less happy when she realised that there was no old woman waiting there. She put the bucket on the ground and she sat next to the well and folded her arms. She looked around for the old woman, but she wasn't there. She waited minutes. She waited at least an hour, and then she heard the sound of horses' hooves and the tinkling of tiny bells. She looked further along the path, and coming along the path there was a beautiful white horse. And riding the white horse was a beautiful woman wearing beautiful silks, and hanging from her dress were tiny silver bells. The beautiful woman rode her horse up to the well and looked down at the stepmother's daughter. And she said, "Oh, it is such a hot day. Please, could I have some water from the well to drink, for my lips are very dry." And the stepsister looked up at the beautiful woman and said, "Why are you asking me? Of course you can have water if you want it. Where's your bucket?" And the beautiful woman looked down at her and said, "Well, I thought that you might fetch some water for me in your bucket." The stepsister looked up and said, "Me? Get water for you? Oh, all right then." So she took the bucket, she hung it on the chain, she lowered it in the well, and she pulled it back and handed it to the beautiful woman on the horse. There wasn't much water in the bucket, just enough to cover the bottom of the bucket, so the beautiful woman reached her hand in, wetted her hand, and then applied the water to her lips. And she said, "Thank you. I am grateful," and handed the bucket back to the stepsister. And the stepsister took the bucket and said, "I should think you would be grateful, and I hope I get my reward." And as the beautiful woman rode off on her beautiful white horse, she looked over her shoulder and said, "Oh yes, you certainly will have your reward." The stepsister waited by the well until she could wait no longer, because the sun had started to go down. And so she headed off home, stomping all the way. And she was in such a bad mood, she'd even left the bucket behind at the well. She walked in the house and her mother said to her, "Where have you been?" And the stepsister said, "Don't talk to me." Huh? But as she said the words, "Don't talk to me," from her lips fell snakes and slugs and toads. And her mother said, "Where did they come from?" And the stepsister said, "I don't know." And as she said, "I don't know," from her lips fell frogs and lizards. She told her mother the story of the beautiful woman who rode up on a beautiful white horse to the well. And her mother said, "You fool! That was the fairy." By the end of the discussion of what happened at the well, of course, the floor was covered in slithering and crawling creatures. The stepsister was locked in the shed because her mother couldn't stand the sight of slugs and snakes and lizards and frogs falling from her lips. And her mother fed her by putting plates of food under the door of the shed. And as for the young woman, her stepmother couldn't stand to see her. to be reminded that when she spoke, from her lips fell diamonds and rubies and pearls. She threw her out of the house. Now the young woman had not enjoyed living with her stepmother and her stepsister, but it was a home. And now she was on the street, walking along the road, homeless. And as she walked along the road, the tears coursing down her face, she heard the sound of horses' hooves. She looked over her shoulder, and riding along the road was a beautiful black stallion. And riding the black stallion was a handsome young man who pulled the horse to a halt and looked down at the young woman and said, "May I ask you, why are you crying?" So she told him her story. And as she spoke, it seemed to him that her words were so beautiful, so gentle. They shone. Her words shone like diamonds and rubies and pearls. And of course, the inevitable happened. He fell in love with her. And as she told her story and looked into this young man's eyes and realized that he wanted to hear what she had to say, and he cared about what she said, well, she fell in love with him. And so, with her consent, he lifted her onto his horse, and they rode off back to the palace. For, of course, he wasn't only a handsome young man. He was a handsome prince, and they were married, and they lived happily ever after. As for her stepsister, I suspect that she's still locked in the shed. And if you don't want to be locked in the shed and have your food passed under the door on a plate, perhaps you need to make sure that when you speak, your words are not words that are like slugs and snails and frogs and lizards, but that your words shine like diamonds and rubies and pearls. And if you and I do that, perhaps we'll have our happy ending too. And that was the story of snakes and pearls, and that was how I have told it to you.